James Fetzer, thank you for joining me in the trenches.
My great pleasure, Jeremy. Love your shows.
With regards, James, to JFK, it happened so long ago. Why does it matter?
What was a pivotal turning point in American history? Every president thereafter, and we had a series, would not have occupied that office but for his death. We had Lyndon Johnson, who was the plot master behind the assassination to accede to the presidency. We had Richard Nixon, who'd actually been a participant in the ratification meeting at the home of Clinton Murchison Sr. the night before. We had Gerald Ford, who was J. Edgar's man on the Warren Commission, keeping him informed of exactly how developments were going. Jimmy Carter is kind of a blip. We had George Herbert Walker Bush sending a message to Ronald Reagan to let George do it with the attempted assassination, and thereafter, American history would have been substantially different but for the death of JFK.
It's such a big topic. I don't even know where to start. So, James, you drive it.
Well, the day of the assassination, Jeremy, the Secret Service and the FBI concluded there had been 3 shots fired from above and behind. One had hit JFK in the back, about 5.5 inches below the collar, just to the right of the spinal column. The second had hit John Connally in the back. And the third had hit JFK in the back of the head, killing him. They were accurate regarding those 3 shots. However, none of them were fired by the alleged assassin, Lee Oswald. In fact, it's remarkable how easy it is to disprove the Warren Commission report built on the 3-shot scenario. Here's Acting Press Secretary Malcolm Kilduff explaining the president was dead. It was a simple matter of a bullet right through the head while pointing to his right forehead. Obviously not a shot fired from above and behind. Indeed, the very afternoon of the assassination, there was massive live coverage by the networks, including some famous newsmen of their time. For example, on the left here, you see Chet Huntley, who are reporting 2 different wounds. The one to the right temple, which was attributed to Admiral George Berkeley, the president's personal physician. A second, a small clean puncture wound to the throat, which Malcolm Perry, MD, during a press conference following Malcolm Kilduff's announcement of the president's death, had identified 3 times as a wound of entry, that the bullet was coming at him, so that in the evening, when the story started to trickle in, that the Secret Service and the FBI had identified the shots from above and behind. Frank McGee, who is nobody's fool, said, "This is incongruous. How can the man have been shot from in front, from behind?" And indeed, when we analyze the source and the trajectories, it turns out we already have here 4 shots to JFK. The shot to the back, which was actually fired from the top of the county records building. The shot to the back of the head, that would be fired from the Dow Tex. The shot to the throat, that was fired from inside the triple underpass. And the shot to the right forehead, fired from the intersection of the triple underpass and the picket fence, to which we shall return. Indeed, a new book has now nailed a 3rd shot to the head, fired from the side. David W. Mantic, MD, PhD, who's the world's leading expert on the medical evidence, has identified, based upon the most meticulous, objective scientific research, that Jack was actually hit 3 different times in the head. In the back of the head, after the limousine had been brought to a halt. Most Americans have no idea that William Greer, the driver, pulled the limousine to the left and to a halt after Jack had been hit twice, once in the back, that shot fired from the top of the county records building, and the shot to the throat fired from inside the triple underpass. Because he was still alive, the driver pulled the limousine to the left and to a halt. and he was hit 3 times in the back of the head by that shot from the Daltex. And then Jackie, he slumped forward. Jackie eased him back up, was looking him right in the face when he was hit that shot with the right temple, and near simultaneously a shot from the side of the head that blew his brains out with such force that Officer Bobby Hargis, riding to the rear there, you can see him in the photograph in the background, hit so hard with the debris he initially thought he himself had been shot. Meanwhile, they went out of their way to frame the patsy Lee Harvey Oswald. Lee was actually in the doorway of the book depository when the JFK motorcade passed by. They even made him remove his overshirt before doing mugshot because of resemblance to the figure in the famous photograph, the most important photograph taken during the assassination by AP photographer James Olson, made it rather conspicuous it was the same person. He had told Will Fritz, the homicide detective investigating the case, he'd been out front with Bill Shelley, one of his supervisors in the book depository, which was not only correct, but everything Lee told Fritz has turned out to be true. So here's his most famous photograph. The shot at JFK's throat actually passed through the windshield, and if you look right here, where his left ear would be visible, if his left ear were visible, you can see a small white spiral nebula with a dark hole in the center, which turns out to be the effect of firing a high-velocity weapon through a windshield, which also, interestingly, makes the sound of a firecracker as it passes through, because many of the witnesses said what they took to be the first shot actually sounded like a firecracker. Here you have the figure in the doorway. Turns out to be Lee Oswald. As we'll discover, they did a fair amount of alteration, but couldn't conceal the fact. Here's a window in the Daltex framed by the fire escape, from which the anti-Castro Cuban fired 3 shots with a Mannlicher Carcano, which was so unreliable weapon, known as the humanitarian rifle in World War II for never harming anyone on purpose. He had 2 misses, one injuring a distant bystander by the name of James Tague when it hit the curbing and a chunk of concrete cut his cheek, and the other, the chrome strip over the limousine. But after the vehicle was brought to a halt, he managed to hit Jack in the back of the head. And notice Lyndon's security service is already reacting, even though Jack's is acting as though they have no idea what's going on. Here, then, is the close-up area for the figure known as Doorman. That turns out to be Lee Oswald. Now, there are any number of peculiarities you can see here. For example, where is Doorman's left shoulder? It's missing. Why? Because a figure known as Black Tie Man has been introduced and is both in front of him and behind him at the same time, which obviously is an optical impossibility, proof of alteration. We have a black man's head introduced here. It will turn out to obscure the features of the shirt that Doorman was wearing. Here we have a figure holding his hands up to protect his eyes from the sun, but whose face has been blacked out, referred to as Black Hole Man. Notice his shirt has been completely obfuscated for reasons that will become apparent. Indeed, when Lee was arrested, he was wearing this long-sleeve, richly textured shirt, rather tattered and torn, he'd brought back from Russia. Marina has acknowledged that she remembers laundering that shirt. And of course, it was so similar to the shirt being worn by Doorman. In fact, we have the height, the weight, the build, the shirt, the T-shirt, so similar. Richard Hook did brilliant work comparing the 2 figures. He began with 7 or 8 similarities, but wound up with over 50, because, of course, it actually is the same person. The Dallas PD were so aware that this was Lee Oswald, in order to obfuscate the resemblance to doorman, they had him remove his outer shirt before they took his mug shot. Meanwhile, Larry Rivera has done a superposition on the faces with another figure that the Warren Commission claimed was a doorman, a fellow named Billy Lovelady, who was 2 or 3 inches shorter than Lee and 15 to 20 pounds heavier, who himself said he couldn't imagine how they could be confused, but it was a deliberate obfuscation on the part of the Warren Commission staff because he was in the doorway, as I'm going to explain. When you do a superposition, you find if you put the pupils of the eyes equidistant on an imposed photograph taken from similar dimensions, then if it's the same person, all the features will align. That's Lee on the left. All the features align. Billy on the right, they do not. The nose is wrong. The cheeks are wrong. The jaw is wrong because it's not Billy Lovelady. Here's another where you can see rather clearly it was Lee Oswald in the doorway, which means he not only cannot have been the lone demented gunman, but he cannot have fired any of the shots, where there turned out to have been 10 or 12 altogether. Meanwhile, the other figure with his hands raised turns out to be Billy Lovelady. Amazing. And here you have Larry doing a reconstruction. Billy was actually asked to come in by the FBI on the 29th of February, 1964, wearing the same clothing he wore at the time of the assassination. And he came in wearing a short-sleeved red and white vertically striped shirt and blue jeans, which, of course, is why they had to white it out so it wouldn't be obvious. And there you have Lee, similarly, in the reddish-brown shirt he was wearing at the time. The government was so insistent to prove that the altered photograph had not been altered when it obviously had been, that they went to some obscure newspapers and created fake versions of their editions for the assassination on Friday. Here you have the News Palladium. Here's the authentic extra issue that day. Here, however, is a CIA-created fake so that individuals like Robert Groden and Josiah Thompson, who had infiltrated the JFK research movement in order to mislead it, have insisted proved the photograph could not have been altered. But clearly, we've seen the impossibilities that prove it was. Meanwhile, in addition to frame Lee, they created a series of backyard photographs. Fritz showed Lee one of the staged backyard photographs. Lee explained it was his face pasted on someone else's body and that he'd be able to prove it. He knew something about photography. He had it exactly right, but didn't live long enough to establish the fact. Jim Mars and I did research on the figure in the background. It turns out to have been Roscoe White, who was a CIA guy who had joined the Dallas Police Department and was on the grassy knoll at the time of the assassination. A very bad dude. So here's a famous photograph published on the cover of Life magazine, intended to implicate Lee holding the Mannlicher Carcano he's alleged to have used to shoot the president with a revolver in a holster he allegedly used to shoot Officer J.D. Tippit, and holding 2 communist newspapers, The Worker and The Militant. Very interesting indeed, because The Worker and The Militant had antithetical communist philosophies, and if they members of each were to encounter one another, they'd break out in fights, fisticuffs, or even try to kill one another. The fact that he had a revolver, moreover, is very telling, because as Robert Groden in his book, The Search for Lee Harvey Oswald, explains, the first officer on the scene found 4 shell casings where Officer Tippit had been shot 3 times in the chest and once in the in the head, the right temple, coincidentally, that had been ejected from automatics, two different manufacturers, Western and Remington Rand. He initialed the cartridges. Subsequently, however, they had to make a replacement of the cartridges ejected from automatics, since Lee only had a revolver with revolver cartridges, and now there were three of one make and one of the other, none of which bore the initials of the first officer on the scene, and of course, advancing the attempt to frame him. Now, Jack White was a legendary student of JFK and eventually would become a masterful student not only of 9/11, but of the moon landings, realized that since the newspapers had known dimensions, they functioned as an internal ruler to ascertain the height of the individual, which turned out to be only about 5'6" tall, too short to be Lee, who was around 5'10", which occurred because either they used a body double who is too short to be Lee, or more likely, in fact, I would assert certainly, they introduced the newspapers a bit too large when they fabricated the photographs. There are actually four of them altogether. No two handheld snapshots should match, but Oswald's face is an exact match. They use the same face in the four different poses, which would have been an optical impossibility. Now, here we have the head of the medical panel, actually, talking for the HSCA when they reinvestigated the assassination in 1977-78, and actually tried to do the cover-up better than Warren had done, quite embarrassing, observing if the backyard photographs are invalid, how they were produced poses far-reaching questions in the area of conspiracy, for they evince a degree of technical sophistication that it would almost necessarily raise a possibility that someone conspired not only to kill the president, but to make Oswald a patsy, just as he declared. And indeed, you can see when you study the photographs, they have different chins even, and there's an insert line here you can see between the chin, which is kind of a block chin, unlike Lee's more tapered chin, and his lower lip, clearly fabricated. Jim Mars and I noticed the backyard guy had a very odd lump on his wrist from a bone that never healed properly. It's the same in both. Turns out to, we agreed, have been Roscoe White. And indeed, it turns out that a ghost image, this is a kind of silhouette that would be used if you were going to frame the photographs, was found in the desk of a Dallas detective. Now, the Dallas PD appear to have been given the assignment of framing Lee, and they did not do a very professional job of it. Meanwhile, Larry Rivera found a photograph of Roscoe White and superimposed it over the backyard photographs. Roscoe had a far heftier build. He was thicker in the chest. He was more muscular than Lee. So notice how Roscoe fills out the image of the backyard man, the body double. Lee does not. In fact, look here. This shows how slight Lee is and that it could not possibly have been Lee's body in the backyard photographs, even though it was Lee's face. Meanwhile, the Secret Service set up JFK for the hit. We actually have more than 15 indications. Agents were left behind at Love Field. The limousines were in the wrong order. Manhole covers were not welded. Windows were left open. Crowds spilling into the street. The route was changed 4 days earlier to bring the target into the kill zone, and they were out already cleaning up evidence at Parkland Hospital. Stunning stuff. Thus, two agents who would have accompanied the limousine were left behind in Love Field by Emery Rodberts, the agent in charge of Presidential Protection Detail. Here's one, Henry Ribka, expressing dismay at being called off. The motorcycle escort was reduced to 4. who were instructed not to ride forward of the rear wheels of the presidential limousine. One of them observed it was the damnedest formation he'd ever seen. JFK's military aide, who normally sat between the driver and the agent in charge, was moved to the last vehicle, along with the president's personal physician. Notice, had he been sitting between the driver, William Greer, and Roy Kellerman, the agent in charge, he would have blocked the shot that passed through the windshield and hit JFK in the throat. There were more than 15 indications of Secret Service complicity in setting him up. In addition to the agents being left behind at Love Field, the manhole covers were not welded shut. Open windows were not covered. The crowd was allowed to spill into the street. Look at this. Absolutely stunning. The 110th Military Intelligence Unit was ordered to stand down. They would have been present for crowd control over the adamant opposition of the commanding officer. They wanted chaos of this kind. Notice how easy it would have been for an assassin with a handgun in the bus to have taken out the president. A simple shot, a total lack of security. Meanwhile, Governor Connolly was instrumental in making a change to the motorcade route on November 18th. 4 days before the event. Normally, a motorcade route once fixed is never changed, so a Secret Service can check every building and screen its occupants. This change, of course, brought the president past the school book depository building and into the kill zone, where Dealey Plaza was ideal for an ambush. Most tellingly, the vehicles were in an improper sequence. The presidential limousine was placed first. Lower-ranking dignitaries, such as the mayor and the vice president, should have preceded him. After all, the crowd will cheer for the mayor and the vice president, but they really came to see Jack and Jackie. If he's there right off the bat, who's going to bother to stick around for these lower-ranking dignitaries? Reporters were moved to the rear, and the president's personal physician to the last car, which put him in the worst location. Should his patient require emergency medical treatment? And let me add, the vehicles were all of different makes and models and colors, which enabled the perpetrators to identify where everyone was located in the motorcade at any time. At Parkland, where the moribund president was taken, a Secret Service agent took a bucket and sponge and began cleaning up the blood and brains from the limousine. Notice, that's already the destruction of evidence. When onlookers noticed a through-and-through hole in the windshield, the vehicle was moved. Now, the agent assigned was the driver of the Secret Service Cadillac, who confirmed to his neighbor that during the process he found a whole bullet, evidently the shot to the back, which only entered about as far as the second knuckle on your little finger, had worked its way out, took it inside and left it on a stretcher at the hospital, would later be used to play the role of the magic bullet, but there was nothing magic about it. Meanwhile, the Zapruder film, the whole movie, was extensively edited. Now, charlatans like Josiah Thompson and Robert Groden insist that the Zapruder film is the closest thing we have to absolute truth about the assassination of John F. Kennedy. But that's utter nonsense. There have been extensive alterations. Wounds have been covered up. They removed more frames from the film that remain in the extant version of 487. There ought to have been around 1,000. The hit to JFK back of the head was merged with a hit to the right temple. I discovered it was visible in later frames, such as 374 and 375. In other words, they had spent so much time concealing the blowout to the back of the head in early frames, I suspected they might have overlooked. You could see it in later, where the blowout, as you can see, corresponds to Mantix area P, from the altered JFK x-rays, area P for patching. He detailed through the most minute studies using optical densitometry, a technique from physics, to identify an area that was created by exposure of something far too dense to be human bone, which he identified as area P. Thus, superposition of frames 312, the white outline, and 313 black, shows sharp forward movement in an 18th of a second before the left and backward snap we see in the extant version of the film. That's from the shot fired from the back of the head, where Jack slumped forward, Jack eased him back up, and then he was in the right temple. When frames 313 black outline and 316 white outline, it's clear the president was forced left and backward under the impact of the fatal shot. But no one there actually observed the violent back into the left motion, which was produced by removing an excessive number of frames. Thus, and this is the most important scientific part of Josiah Thompson's book, 6 Seconds in Dallas, where in the conclusion he disavows any proof of conspiracy, and yet the evidence there is extensive and compelling, where there's a normal motion of the president's head up until 312 when it moves violently forward, and then, because they merged the two, back and to the left in a dramatic fashion. Conclusive proof of conspiracy. Here we have then the extant version of the Zapruder. This was done using the techniques of optical printing and special effects, which allowed him to combine any foreground with any background. You'll notice there's a break when the limousine is coming up Houston, turning onto Elm. All of a sudden, boom, there you'll see the limousine. Notice the spectators in the foreground are not reacting the way they have everywhere else on the motorcade, and that's because that footage was taken from earlier filming when the pilot car passed, not when the presidential limousine was present. Further proof of the fabrication of what we have today. Watch. So here you have, these are lead motorcycle. This is not the motorcycle escort. Then boom, there you have the motorcade. They cut the turn from Houston onto Elm. It appears because the driver swung out too widely. Now, boom, we've got that back into the left, which no one observed in Dealey Plaza that day. None of the witnesses. I'll repeat again. Look, how we're watching, then all of a sudden, boom, the limousine is present from skipping the turn from Houston onto Elm. They even took out the Stemmons freeway sign, which apparently had a bullet hole in it, and they made it appear as though the limousine moved continuously, when in fact it came to a dramatic halt, which endured, by my count, at least 20 seconds. So here you have it, 312. Now, this is from the shot from behind. 313, where it's supposed to have been hit. You already have a blowout at the back of the head that's being concealed. They moved around this feature, which is known as the blob, to try to create the impression as though there were a blowout in the front of the head. But even Jackie, during her testimony, said, from the front, he looked just fine, but she had a terrible time holding his skull and brains together at the back of his head. So we have ample proof of Zapruder film fabrication, but Josiah Thompson and Robert Groden want to deny the evidence. Clearly, they have a role. Well, as mentioned, I thought it might be visible later, and indeed at frames 374, 375, when Jackie is climbing out on the back of the trunk for a chunk of Jack's skull and brains that she held in her hand all the way to Parkland. You can actually see the blowout. You can actually see it. Here you have it. Now, this pink flap, that's like a skull extension that's still connected to the skull. That's not the blowout. It is here. Notice it's sort of bluish gray. Remember how often they refer to brain matter as gray matter. There you have it. It was my suspicion that those who were involved in reconstructing the home movies of the assassination, including the Zapruder, might have overlooked frame past 313 through 316 that display the wound to the back of the head. I found this image of the blowout in frame 374. So here you have 312, then later frames, and now you have the comparison to the blowout with that pinkish flap extension. Here you see Mantic, who, looking at the autopsy x-rays, thought there was too much contrast between dark and light. I mean, between 100 to 1,000 times greater contrast. He performed these very minute measurements using the technique of optical densitometry, which were benefited by his myopia at the time, which enabled him to make these hundreds of measurements to define area P for patch. And then when you compare area P with the blowout, very similar, except, of course, some of JFK's hair overlaps. Meanwhile, the wounds were altered and covered up. Many witnesses observed the blowout to the back of the head. 2 Parkland physicians drew diagrams of what it looked like. The mortician who prepared the body described it and more. The HSCA absurdly attempted to reconstitute the back of the head. I'll explain what a monstrosity it was for them to do this. Here you have witnesses: Beverly Oliver, Phil Willis, Marilyn Willis, Ed Hoffman, all in Dealey Plaza, talking about the blood at the back of the head. Then you have the doctors at Parkland: McClellan, Peterson, Salyer, Carrico, Delaney, Crenshaw, Jones, Nurse Aubrey Bell, describing the blood at the back of the head. Even Theron Ward, the justice of the peace. And then we have Aubrey Wright, who was the ambulance driver. He helped to wrap the body in sheets and place it into the bronze ceremonial casket. And then from Bethesda, Frank O'Neill, an FBI agent who was present during the autopsy, Gerald Custer, Paula O'Connor, Floyd Reeby. I've spoken with these gentlemen about the blowout to the back of the head. Here's a diagram approved by Dr. McClellan. As you can see, it was a massive wound. Dr. Charles Crenshaw drew for me these 2 diagrams, one from the back and one from the side, to indicate the enormity of the wound. Here you have multiple doctors at Parkland describing the extrusion of cerebellar as well as cerebral brain tissue, where the cerebellum is a compact part of the brain above the brainstem. They look very different. For example, cerebellar would be sort of more like a granular, tiny wormy-like, whereas the cerebellum would be more hamburger-like. Thus, the mortician who prepared the body for burial told investigators, in addition to a large gaping hole in the back of the head, there was a small wound in the right temple and a wound to the back, 5 to 6 inches below the shoulder to the right of the spinal column. Notice, he believes it was patched, that they filled the skull with plaster of Paris. That was a smaller wound in the right temple. This was crescent-shaped flap down. That's the bone extension I described still attached. There were small shrapnel wounds in the face backed with wax. He discovered this when embalming fluid flooded through. David Mantic brilliantly inferred those little tiny wounds were caused by shards of glass when the bullet passed through the windshield that impacted Jack in the face. Wound in the back, 5 to 6 inches, actually 5.5 inches below the shoulder, just to the right of the backbone. Adrenaline gland and brain removed. Other organs removed and put back. No swelling or discoloration to the face. That means he died instantly. He was dead in Dealey Plaza. Meanwhile, get this. When the House Select Committee on Assassination reinvestigated the case in 77-78, its medical panel concluded the entry wound was actually 4 inches above the entry wound previously specified at Bethesda. It was depicted in diagrams, right, but not visible in photographs. In other words, they made up a wound to the top of the head. They ignored the fact the actual impact was more in the vicinity where I have the cursor here. They moved it up 4 inches. There's that skull flap I was talking about, very clearly visible pink in 374, 375. Notice no hole in the top of the head in the photograph, only in the diagrams. Thus, we have the complete absurdity. We have the bona fide wound that was seen at Parkland and described by multiple physicians. At Bethesda, it was enlarged. Commander Humes, in charge of the autopsy, took a cranial saw to the skull of JFK and enlarged the wound to make it look as though something that could have been caused by a shot from behind had the president been leaning far forward over. It is described in mathematical detail in the Bethesda autopsy report. Unmistakable. And nevertheless, the medical panel for the HSCA sought to reconstitute the back of the head as though they could get away with redoing the cover-up. Outrageous. Anyone with any doubts about conspiracy here and cover-up, this is cast iron proof. Meanwhile, they even used a body double in some of the autopsy photographs. Dennis David, who was the NCO responsible for logging parties in and out of the morgue, was ordered not to log in the body of the major. His body was then used for some of the autopsy photographs. The throat wound was also documented as a wound of entry. The Warren report, of course, covered it up via the magic bullet. Meanwhile, here you have some autopsy photographs on the left of the major, not of JFK. Robert Groden has promoted these as though they were authentic. They are not. Here you have again from the side, the major. Now, if you got millions of armed forces to choose between, you're going to be able to find some figures who resemble almost anyone. In this case, they found a major who resembled JFK. But look here in this GIF, you can see it's not the same shape and size of cranium. It's not JFK. In fact, Bobby and Jackie, talking about an open casket, said it didn't even look like Jack. And that appears to have been because they'd made the substitution, and it was not. Meanwhile, here you have Malcolm Perry on the right, who was reporting during the Parkland press conference about the shot to the throat, and Kemp Clark, the director of neurosurgery at Parkland, who explained it, the bullet through the head. Meanwhile, Charles Crenshaw drew for me the wound to the throat before a simple tracheostomy incision was made by Malcolm Perry and after. Small, clean puncture wound, clearly a wound of entry. Now, in some of the autopsy photographs, they enlarged the wound. This was done by calling Bob Livingston, MD, by Commander Humes to ask what the throat wound would have looked like had it been an exit wound instead of an entry. This is the major. In fact, Charles Crenshaw explained to me how he was the last physician to observe the body when it was wrapped in sheets and placed in the bronze ceremonial casket, and he had closed JFK's eyes. From 1970s, Lifton argued the bright reddish-white wound that seemed to appear snake up the side of the president's head, which he called the blob that was moving around, completely disagreed with the description of the head wound given by the doctors and nurses at Parkland, where the president was taken. David has proven, by the way, that the alleged magic bullet, where when they discovered that one shot had missed and injured a distant bystander, since they committed themselves to 3 and only 3 shots having been fired, they had to account now for all the wounds with only 2 bullets. They had Gerald Ford redescribe the wound to the back, initially in the report his uppermost back, which was already an exaggeration, to the base of the back of the neck, to turn the throat wound from an entry wound to an exit by claiming it entered the base of the back of the neck and trajectory, passed through the body without hitting any bony structures and exited the throat, but it turns out to be anatomically impossible. David W. Mantic, MD, PhD, who was board certified in radiation oncology, took a CAT scan of a patient with chest and neck dimensions similar to those at JFK. When he plotted the official trajectory, it turned out to be anatomically impossible because cervical vertebrae intervened. Meanwhile, the limo stop was edited out. During the limo stop, he was hit at least twice in the head. Actually, it turns out 3 times. Officer Baker dismounted his bike and ran to the grassy knoll. Officer Jackson rode up the grassy knoll until his bike fell over and proceeded on foot. 5 Secret Service agents surrounded the limo and 1 even climbed in. Here you have Zapruder up on his pedestal with his secretary, where Jack White observed that the secretary seemed to be blocking the filming by Zapruder, which may have been done by a camera on a tripod in the pergola, which would explain why the limousine disappears. If you're following it with a handheld camera, you'll keep it centered. But notice how it virtually disappears at the bottom. Here you have, right about the time of the limo stop, Clint Hill is rushing forward. Multiple events take place. Here's a comparison between the Knicks and the Zapruder. Or rather, here you have Clint going up. Jackie is climbing out. This is where you can actually see the wound. Jackie goes back in. In the Knicks, however, Jackie and Clint actually make physical contacts, not in the Zapruder. So there at the top, you have the Zapruder, contrast with the Knicks. This was a failure when the CIA edited the film to coordinate them properly. Meanwhile, during the limo stop, as I say, Officer Hargis dismounted his bike, ran between the limousines, impossible had they been in motion, up to the grassy knoll. Officer Jackson motored his bike up the knoll until it fell over and proceeded on foot. 5 surrounded the limousine, and believe it or not, one of them, by the name of Glenn Bennett, actually climbed into the limousine. Here you can see some of the marks on the grassy knoll from Officer Jackson motoring up the embankment. And here you have Officer Hargis returning to his bike after everyone else had proceeded. This is Gene Hill and Mary Mormon, and that's Beverly Oliver after the limousine is rushed off to Parkland. Even the Oklahoma City Times picked up on it. A motorcycle patrolman rode pell-mell up a railroad embankment, apparently in pursuit of the assassin. But of course, there were multiple. Larry Rivera has done brilliant work on the JFK horseman, the motorcycle patrolman, and how all of this was faked and how it was removed from the Zapruder film. Meanwhile, those who knew him best fingered LBJ. Madeline Duncan Brown began an affair with him in 1948, bore him a son, Stephen, in 1950. Billy Celestis and Barb McClellan also knew parties involved. Roger Stone has laid out the case for LBJ having killed JFK, and E. Howard Hunt explained the chain of command to his son, St. John, when he believed he was on his deathbed. Here's Madeline, Texas, in the morning. Because her affair with Lyndon was well known, she was invited to many social occasions, including what turned out to be the ratification meeting at the home of Clint Murchison Sr. the night before. J. Edgar was there, Richard Nixon were there, H.L. Hunt was there. When Lyndon showed up unexpectedly late in the evening, they disappeared into a boardroom for 15 or 20 minutes. And when it broke up, he strode over toward her, and she has told me she expected he was going to whisper sweet nothing in her ear. Instead, he said in a hateful tone of voice, "After tomorrow, those Kennedy boys will never embarrass me again. That's not a threat, that's a promise." He even called her the following morning to repeat. 6 weeks later, during a rendezvous at the Driscoll Hotel on New Year's Eve, Madeline confronted Lyndon with rumors rampant in Dallas at the time that he'd been involved. Since no one stood to gain more personally, Lyndon blew up at her and told her the oil boys and the CIA had decided that Jack had to be taken out. But the plot originated with him. The title comes from the fact that When they'd awaken in the morning, he'd open the windows and bellow out, "God, I love Texas," in the morning. Meanwhile, Billy Saul Estes, who was a crony of Connally and Lyndon, had conversation with Malcolm Mac Wallace, who was Lyndon's personal hitman, who murdered a dozen people for Lyndon, including one of his own sisters, and Cliff Carter, who was his chief administrative aide, and became convinced that they had been involved in the assassination. Barr McClellan worked at the home of a very powerful attorney in Texas, where much of the plotting for the assassination took place, and reported in his book, Blood, Money, and Power, how LBJ killed JFK. Roger Stone, of course, a political gadfly, very knowledgeable, published a book, The Man Who Killed Kennedy, the case against LBJ, noting that Malcolm Mac Wallace fingerprints had been found in the book depository on one of the boxes used to set up the assassin's lair. Rolling Stone published The Last Confession of E. Howard Hunt, who was deeply involved with CIA, who has admitted to having been in Dallas at the time, but said he was not actively involved in the event. Nevertheless, he knew a great deal about it. He confided in his son, St. John, a narrative, the chain of command, when he believed he was on his deathbed. He said the order went from LBJ to Cord Meyer, in charge of covert ops for CIA, to David Atlee Phillips, CIA, Western Hemisphere, to William Harvey, who was in charge of CIA assassination worldwide, to David Sanchez Morales for Dallas. It turns out the Mexico City trip was a fabrication. Lee was alleged to have gone there to obtain a visa to travel to Cuba. He wasn't there, as photos and audio recordings have proven. It wasn't his voice, it wasn't his image. 3 of the CIA assets involved in this were presidents of Mexico. Lee's passport, it turns out, was even stamped invalid for travel to Cuba. Thus, Larry Rivera has done impeccable work on the Mexico City tape and how the whole thing was fabricated. It's fascinating. You can find it on his blog. The real Lee Oswald never set foot in Mexico City in the fall of 1963. Recent discoveries locating a passport he renewed on 24 June 1963, which was quietly suppressed by the FBI, have been located and reported in posts here. This is the actual clean version of his passport, which was done by the Dallas Police Department when they took all his personal belongings from Beckley, where he had a rooming house. And here, Cuba, not valid for travel to Cuba. Whole thing a total fraud. Meanwhile, here's a figure that was supposed to be Lee Oswald in Mexico City. Obviously not. As though the commission couldn't get even the simplest facts straight. Meanwhile, putting the pieces together, George H.W. Bush and Edward Lansdale were on the ground in Dealey Plaza. Exposing a cover-up narrows the range of possible suspects. Noel Twyman was the first to lay out the dimensions of the plot. It was hatched in Los Angeles in 1960 at the DNC convention. I may have been the first to identify George Herbert Walker Bush standing here. This is from a series of photographs published by Jesse Curry, chief of police of Dallas at the time, after he retired and became head of security for 7-Eleven stores. They published Jesse Curry's JFK assassination files in paperbacks, only available at 7-Eleven stores. Here are a group of CIA agents, officials, at the corner of Houston and Elm paying their last respects. They included Grayson Litch, Eddie Bayo, not David Morales, although he looks like him. This is a fellow named Pushpenny, Ted Shackley, Rip Robertson, Tracy Barnes, paying their last respects. As backup patsies, I'm convinced we had the 3 trams. The first, actual Charles Rogers, known as Frenchie. The second, Charles Harrelson, the father of the actor Woody Harrelson, and the third, Chauncey Marvin Holt, whom I met personally, sometimes mistaken for E. Howard Hunt, where Chauncey was instructed. He was a forger, a counterfeiter, an assassin, very talented guy who was instructed by his handler, Philip Twombly, to prepare 15 sets of Secret Service credentials for use in and around Dealey Plaza. He was directed to leave them in a red pickup truck that would be found in the parking lot behind the grassy knoll, which most Americans do not know to this day was used by the Dallas Police Department. When he arrived, the pickup truck wasn't there. He wandered around Dealey Plaza and told me he saw more hitmen and assassins than you'd find at a Soldiers of Fortune convention. When he returned, the pickup truck was there, so he left the documents in the appointed place. He had been directed to proceed with Harrelson and the man Rogers he knew as Richard Montoya to a boxcar at the railroad yard behind the parking lot, that there'd be a boxcar that would appear to be locked but would not be. They got in and found it was loaded with explosives, ammunition, and weapons. They thought they were secure when the train started to pull out, but the supervisor thought something was wrong, directed the police who found them, arrested them, and walked them through Dealey Plaza. Here you have a man with a very distinctive gait, distinctive hand and ring. That is Edward Lansdale, walking past the three tramps. Had this been a proper conducted, they would not have allowed civilians in the vicinity. Meanwhile, we not only had Bush there in front of the book depository, but Lansdale waiting to report to Bush. Meanwhile, although you've heard many stories about had there been a large-scale conspiracy, people would have talked and nobody talked. It's absolutely false. This is from a single paragraph in Noel Twyman's Bloody Treason, published in 1997. Colors Marcello bragged about it. Jack would be killed. Santo Travagani, the same. Joseph Miltier explained how it would be done. Johnny Rosselli told Jack Anderson Ruby was their man. David Atlee Phillips said before he died, fringe elements of U.S. intel might have been involved. He knew better. Nothing fringe about it. Madeline Brown explained how Lyndon said he would be killed before it happened. Marita Lawrence, who'd actually been a paramour of Fidel, stated in deposition how Frank Sturgis told him he and some anti-Castro Cubans were going to be involved. Chuck Hinsana, in the book Double Cross, that his brother Sam Giancana had explained the mob would be involved. Chauncey even did a radio interview about it. Charles Harrelson explained he had been involved. Jim Hicks said he was a communication coordinator. Jack Ruby said this would never have happened had someone else, such as Adlai Stevenson, been the vice president of the United States. Now, when you consider the alteration of the X-rays, that there was a substitution of another brain, that the Zapruder film was massively edited, the list of potential suspects is narrowed dramatically. The KGB, for example, could not have extended its reach into Bethesda Naval Hospital to alter X-rays under control of medical officers of the U.S. Navy and Secret Service. Anti-Castro Cubans could not have substituted another brain for the brain of JFK. The mob, the mafia, could not have got a hold of the Zapruder film to undertake alterations, which means we're really reduced rapidly to two alternatives. That was the ultimate black op that the CIA did it, or that it was a covert coup d'etat with Lyndon Johnson, the Joint Chiefs, the intel community, the military-industrial complex, all involved, which turns out to be the case. If you can ever find a copy of Bloody Treason, pick it up. Noel Twyman. Next to David Lifton's book, Best Evidence, published originally in 1980, about the medical evidence, this book is the best on the politics of the early works. He wrote, I saw the most perfect combination with the greatest probability of success, which combined CIA military with Secret Service, with Mafia, with LBJ, with J. Edgar. With LBJ and the conspiratorial group, Hoover could have been relied upon to fall into line because the mafia had compromised him. Perhaps that risk would seem acceptable to the plotters once they had LBJ in their circle, but it actually worked the other way around. Thus, when he talks about the plotters, all the mafia had to do was get CIA involved, have the CIA recruit Secret Service and LBJ. It would have had a perfect conspiracy. All LBJ had to do was recruit the CIA, who would use the mafia as needed, and the Secret Service, and he had a perfect conspiracy. Hoover would fall in line after the fact when confronted by LBJ and the mafia with blackmail material they had on him. No, he was in on it from the beginning. In this scenario, right-wing extremists, if involved at all, would have provided money. Thus, the big picture involves distinguishing between the sponsors, the facilitators, and the mechanics, who are the shooters or supervisors and coordinators, including George Herbert Walker Bush, who appears to have overall command, and Edward Lansdale, who appears to have positioned the shooters and determined the sequence of shots. Thus, his sponsors included the CIA. Jack was threatening to shatter the agency into 1,000 pieces. They had a hitman. The Joint Chiefs. Jack had refused to invade Cuba, contrary to the unanimous recommendation, signed an above-ground test ban treaty with the Soviets, contrary to the unanimous opposition, and now was pulling American forces out of Vietnam, where they believed the war had to be taken, a stand against the expansion of international communists. They had a shooter. The anti-Castro Cubans falsely believed Jack had betrayed them at the Bay of Pigs, which the CIA knew better but allowed them to entertain for their own benefit. They had a shooter. The mafia was upset because they thought they had an agreement with Joe Kennedy that if they helped Jack to become elected, they'd ensure Chicago went for Jack and therefore Illinois to guarantee he become president. But when Bobby became Attorney General, he began cracking down on organized crime with more indictments and convictions than ever before in history. They had a shooter. These establishments surrounding the Fed were upset because Jack believed it was absurd for the United States to be paying interest to a consortium of private banks for publishing the currency of the United States, when it could be done equally well by the Department of the Treasury for no interest at all. He'd already done that by publishing United States notes. I remember as a young Marine Corps officer holding one in my hand. It said United States note with a red embossed imprint instead of Federal Reserve note green. They had a shooter. The Texas oil men were upset because Jack was contemplating cutting their oil depletion allowance, a massive tax write-off, close to 25%, on the ground that oil was a finite resource. And by publishing oil on the ground, they were putting themselves out of business. They had a shooter. Israel was at loggerheads with JFK because David Ben-Gurion, the first prime minister and the founder of Israel, wanted to develop nuclear weapons, which Jack opposed, in the belief that it would set off a nuclear arms race in the Middle East. They had a shooter. And of course, Lyndon Johnson, who wanted to become president of all the people, had his own. So we actually had 8 different sponsors, each of whom had their own shooter. The facilitators, Lyndon of the assassination, Edgar of the cover-up, where they appear to have enlisted as project manager Alan Dulles, the former director of the CIA, to put all the pieces together for the big event that would take place in Dallas. Here we have a book about it by David Talbot. Some have thought Dulles should therefore be described as the mastermind behind the assassination. My own belief is that designation belongs to Lyndon. The most important book published about his role by Phil Nelson, LBJ, mastermind of the JFK assassination, where you only have to read a few chapters and you'll understand how ruthless Lyndon was, but how many strengths he had, both for good and for evil. During a conversation with Madeline, she said to me how John Connolly couldn't even describe Lyndon because it would take all the adjectives. And I said, well, no, Madeline, what he meant was Lyndon had no many strengths for good, but also for evil. It would take every adjective in the dictionary. Meanwhile, the shooting looked more like this. The yellow, the 3 shots from the Daltex, that was fired by the anti-Castro Cuban shooter from the top of the county records building. This was a shot to the back. A second shot that went nowhere, that was by the Texas oilman shooter. We had shots to Connolly, followed from the opposite side of the book depository by Lyndon Johnson's hitman. We had a shot to the right temple that was fired by the mafia hitman. We had the shot to the throat from inside the triple underpass by the Joint Chief hitman. We had a shot fired by the CIA guy from the grassy knoll where he would have hit Jackie. They were under explicit instruction not to harm her. He pulled her shot, it wound up in the grass. And now we have the third shot to the head from the grassy knoll by hitman for Israel, David Manick has identified. So how did it all begin? In Los Angeles in 1960, when JFK beat LBJ for the nomination, he invited Stuart Symington, senator of Missouri, to be his running mate, but gave him overnight to think about it. Meanwhile, Bobby went by the LBJ suite, not believing Lyndon would have the least interest, but to extend a pro forma symbolic gesture of inviting him to run with Jack, and was dumbfounded when he jumped on it. He threatened to expose that Jack had Addison's disease, wasn't expected to live a long, healthy life, that among his dalliances was one with a beautiful woman who was a spy for East Germany, of which he had been informed by Edgar, and that if he were not on the ticket, then any legislative proposal sent down by the White House would be dead on arrival, because in his position as a powerful majority leader, he'd bottle them up. Jack and Bobby were baffled, but Lyndon had them boxed in, and they were forced to accede to his demand, the only case in which Jack ever had to rescind a political decision. When one of Lyndon's wealthy backers learned about this development, he burst into the Johnson suite cursing and swearing, because now LBJ would help JFK become president. Bobby Baker took him into a bedroom and explained what they had in mind. He came out all smiles, saying he thought that was an excellent plan. Bobby Baker would later declare in public that JFK would not live out his first term and that he would die a violent death. Lyndon would send Cliff Carter, his chief administrative aide, down to Dallas to make sure all the arrangements were in place for the assassination. For those who want more, check out JFK, Who, How, and Why, Solving the World's Greatest Murder Mystery.
James, there is so much to think about here. You've covered a lot of ground. I suppose a question I have for you is, what is the moral of the story?
That if the powerful enough forces are aligned against you, your life can be terminated at any point. Among the concerns that the right wing at the time had was that Jack would serve 8 years, then Bobby would succeed him to serve 8 years, and then Teddy would arrive to have a Kennedy dynasty. They felt they had to nip it in the bud. And alas, it was all for policy reasons, except in the case of the anti-Castro Cubans who wanted revenge for what they believed to be his betrayal, but which was not, because he made it clear from the beginning there should be no overt U.S. involvement in this effort. It turns out, in retrospect, as Bobby and Maxwell Taylor would discover when they reviewed the Bay of Pigs fiasco on behalf of the president, that the Soviets had learned the date of the invasion that they'd shared it with Fidel Castro, and that the agency itself knew Castro knew we were coming. So all the key players were aware of the basic facts of the case, except for the commander-in-chief, who was deliberately kept in the dark. It was a gross betrayal. And frankly, Jeremy, we have yet to overcome the consequences of that tragic day in Dallas in 1963.
Okay, so James, if I want to follow more of your work, where can I go?
Well, my blog, jameshfetzer.org, I'm doing a lot of radio shows. I have on Revolution Radio, The Raw Deal, Monday, Wednesday, Friday, noon to 2 Eastern, Studio B, and then daily, RBN, Republic Broadcasting Network, authentic news from 3 to 5 Eastern, 5 days a week, Jeremy. And I have lots of blogs out there, any of these sites, but especially my blog. Just do a search on JFK or 9/11 or Sandy Hook. You're going to find a veritable bonanza of information, a whole lot of which I think may come as a surprise.
All right, well, on that note, James Fetzer, thank you for joining me in the trenches.
My great pleasure, Jeremy, always.